So there's a really fascinating piece out in the HuffPost, and this piece was written by Daniel Morans. Now we have been getting some basically these reports that give us inside looks at Bernie Sanders' campaign as well as other campaigns. But recently we got a piece from BuzzFeed that was this really good in-depth breakdown and look at what it was like when Bernie Sanders started to lose the election and the tide started to turn away from him with South Carolina and Super Tuesday and looking at the results. And we got a lot of inside information. These pieces are really great because this is what you don't get to see, and so it's filled with gems that you never hear, you never even knew. And so that's why I love these articles so much, is because they tell me a lot about what's going on behind the scenes, because we see everything that they do publicly, right? Nothing special about that. We see them doing that. We don't see what's going on behind the scenes. So it's a pretty lengthy piece, but Daniel Moran's actually put in tweets basically little pieces. So we're going to go through these pieces because it gives you a summary of what's said in there. So one of the things is Jeff Weaver threatened to quit in May if Bernie wouldn't fund new polling. Now, I guess back in May, Bernie Sanders didn't want to fund internal polling. Internal polling, I guess, is crucial because if you have internal polling, you can decide and figure out where to spend your money and how to spend your money in terms of advertisements. What should we advertise based on? Should we advertise based on Social Security? Should we advertise based on Medicare for All? All that kind of stuff. Jeff Weaver was previously the campaign chair, but he's a high up guy. I think he's a senior campaign advisor this time around. You guys probably know Jeff Weaver. Another piece. 80 Barkan tried to broker talks between Bernie and Warren. Now, he endorsed Elizabeth Warren, but he tried to broker talks between Bernie and Warren. There was no Bernie or Warren folks, I think, that actually confirmed this, but that is supposedly what ended up happening. Bernie aides prepared a line on Biden's, quote, "Nothing will fundamentally change for June debate." He didn't use it. So what this is saying is, you guys remember when Biden said that quote about how nothing will fundamentally change to his donors at a fundraiser with his donors, and Pete, there was this sort of continuous fight within the Bernie campaign between whether or not to go ham on him, because Bernie Sanders was good, but he was he's kind of buddies with Joe Biden in Congress. They were nice to each other, and Bernie liked that, and so it was tough for him to really go ham on Joe Biden. And so some of the people in the Bernie campaign, David Sirota being one of the people who was like, "Hey, you really need to go after Biden hard and really distinguish yourself from him." But he kind of resisted that idea. So they had prepared for him a line on Biden's "Nothing will fundamentally change," but he didn't use it. It's really interesting. Here's another interesting one. It says, some aides were frustrated by campaign manager Faiz Shakir's decision to travel with Bernie, arguing it hampered management of big campaign. Shakir's top deputy, Ari, was also on the road with Bernie. Last full-time presidential campaign for both was John Kerry. So, and then it goes on to say, Mark Longabaugh, consultant and veteran of the 2016 effort, recommended Sanders affiliate as a Democrat and begin campaign with a big speech on race in Chicago. Sanders would end up doing neither. Longabaugh left the campaign early on due to strategic differences. Now, this is really crucial. Now, this guy, Mark Longabaugh, was a senior advisor on the 2016 campaign, and he basically met with Bernie and broke down what Bernie needed to do, and those things that Bernie needed to do. He gave a suggestion about, as you see there, he wanted Bernie to run as a Democrat and become an official Democrat instead of an independent, which is a pretty good idea, I think. And then he wanted Bernie Sanders to make some inroads with the black leadership and the black community in the Congressional Black Caucus, because, as you guys all know who were around in the 2016 primary, basically what ended up happening was it was a sort of insurmountable lead because of the South voting so overwhelmingly in favor of Hillary Clinton. And so what he wanted to do was say, hey, we need to figure out a way to increase our share of the African American vote. Otherwise, we can't win this thing. There's no way to win this thing. And so that's what his plan was. He wanted him to make inroads with black leadership. But Bernie isn't really big on that kind of a thing. He's sort of self-proclaimed as not being big on that kind of thing. And so I guess Mark left. I would love to do an interview with Mark Longabaugh. It'd be really awesome. Um, so he left. So this is a big deal. So basically, what ended up happening after Mark left was there was kind of this vacuum that resulted. And so you kind of take all the vets away, and then you have a bunch of noobs, a bunch of newbies. And so, like Faiz Shakir and these people, Faiz, a campaign manager this time around, he hasn't held a position like that before. He's a noob, he's not a veteran, and he wasn't on the 2016 team, right? So, I think that was a bad move, and I think that Faiz Shakir did make some bad moves in his position, for sure. It says a pro-Sanders activist laments not getting emails answered. The outward motto of the campaign was not me, us, but the real motto seemed like everybody against us or just us. Um, then it says, Analilia Mejia concedes that it was hard to get Sanders to call electeds and union leaders. She leveraged his love for speaking to workers to foment rank and file and local union support for him and block internationals from endorsing Biden. It says, among the calls the campaign did not make, Virginia delegate Marsha Price, a young black woman and the only state lawmaker to endorse Sanders in 2016, never heard from them. Neither did Perio Consigliere and antitrust activist Brennan Gilmore. And so what this means is that basically Bernie Sanders didn't do a good job of courting endorsements from unions. Now, you may think that, they're supposed to outright endorse him, but you really got to send out an invitation and talk to these people, obviously. You have to at least hit them up, and you have to sort of reach out to them, especially when you're talking about endorsements of a group, especially when Elizabeth Warren is running. And so he didn't do a good job of that. They didn't really court any endorsements at all. They didn't do a good job of that. And so Mejia, who was sort of given this small team to try to, rack in all these endorsements, it's like, well, the team is really small, and then Bernie Sanders isn't really down with doing any of it, and so you're kind of, tying your hands behind her back, and so that makes it really difficult to do. So I think that was another big mistake, and this is a lesson to be learned. Endorsements are incredibly important, okay? The two things historically that determine Democratic presidential primaries are fundraising and endorsements from the party. Now, in history, those two things have aligned together, okay? This time it hasn't. Bernie raised way more money, but got virtually no Democratic endorsements, okay? And that hurt him bad. And so you need at least some endorsements. He barely had any endorsements. In fact, he lost a lot of endorsements from 2016. Like Raul Grijalva, he didn't endorse him. Really, really big mistake, man. Especially that they're not reaching out to these people who even endorsed him in 2016. I mean, this is utterly ridiculous. Here's another interesting piece. It says, the Sanders campaign planned to split a plane with the Warren campaign back to Washington after the Iowa debate in mid-January. After the CNN story on Sanders' alleged comments on a woman not being able to win, the communication lines went dark. And so basically what happened here was they were planning to split a plane to go back to Washington. They had to go to Washington. And what ended up happening is the impeachment trial actually ended up hurting Bernie Sanders because instead of being able to go to these more rural areas that he was planning to go to on a bus tour, he was stuck in D.C. For the impeachment trial. And so they were both going back there because obviously they're sitting senators. They're still working as senators. But once that whole story came out, Faiz Shakir said that CNN was lying in the report. Everything went dark. And so that was kind of the end of the communication lines between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders' campaign. That's sort of where it ended. Sanders' team also believed the Warren tussle inflicted permanent damage on the campaign, claiming it prompted a 10-point drop in support from women nationwide. So it's definitely, I think, had an effect on it for sure, like a 10-point drop. That's definitely not helpful and not good at all. So kind of have Elizabeth Warren to thank for that, for making up a fake quote and then going to bat for the quote that's fake. So not good. That's really a tough situation because there's really nothing good that comes out of two people sort of cannibalizing each other. And there was really no good way out of it. But you can't blame Bernie Sanders or his campaign's response because you made up a fake quote and you're essentially slandering him. And so he has to respond by telling his truth. And that's what he did. As has already been reported, a faction of Bernie allies wanted the candidate to cast himself in a more mainstream light, including by tying himself to FDR and the New Deal. One sign he didn't in the New Hampshire debate, the two candidates to mention FDR were Biden and Klobuchar. Another sign he didn't, Sanders did not regularly volunteer information or otherwise tout his pragmatic record and bipartisan accomplishments. Last cycle, he went on TV about VA reform bill. This cycle, he promoted it in a YouTube video with 26,000 views. So this was also a bad move. And so this is something that, they should have done, which is Bernie should have just grabbed onto the legs of FDR and just never let go. Because people love FDR and LBJ. Should have just put himself as an FDR LBJ Democrat because, the Great Society under LBJ, FDR gave you Social Security, and then LBJ expanded on Social Security legislation by instituting Medicare and Medicaid. So really, the boomers, where do they get their money from? Where do they get their health care from? Medicaid or Medicare, and then they get their money from Social Security. Who made those things? FDR and LBJ. Big failing on his part to not do that. And I think overall, and I heard Kyle Kulinski explain this in his talk with Glenn Greenwald, it was basically that it was a mistake to paint himself as this revolutionary, where he should have been more like, he should have accurately pointed out that he's a moderate, in the sense that if you look worldwide, every country has universal health care. Most, industrialized nations have free college education, all of that kind of stuff, right? That would have been the better way forward, because, everybody kind of views themselves as a moderate, even though they all agree with Bernie Sanders on his policy position. So I think that was a mistake. I definitely think that was a mistake. So that was not a good move. Believe it or not, campaign had hoped the now infamous 60 Minutes interview after the Nevada caucus would make Sanders seem presidential and reach older voters to show his viewership. It ended up kicking off a multi-day news cycle about Fidel Castro. So that Fidel Castro thing, it's a really terrible situation, because Bernie Sanders told the truth about Fidel Castro, but a lot of people just can't handle or comprehend the truth, and that's the case certainly here. And so my question is, what could Bernie Sanders have really done to reverse that problem? If Barack Obama made those comments, but he didn't make those comments in 2008. He didn't make those comments in 2012. He made the comment not only when he didn't have any elections to run in, he literally made the comment at a time where he was leaving office. It was in 2016. It was his last year in office. That's not a coincidence. There's a reason for that, okay? There's a reason why he did that. Now, what's interesting is, apparently Bernie actually won the Cuban vote in the Democratic Party, in the Democratic primary. So what that seems to mean is it's not even Cubans in the Democratic primary. I'm sure the Republicans are like that. But it looks like the Cubans in the Democratic primary don't even really care. I guess it must be other Latinos, and it must be other white people, because I guess they look at it and they look at the Fidel Castro as this big boogeyman that they've been brainwashed with. So it's not even so much Cubans in the Democratic primary who are bummed about this. It's everybody else, especially on 60 Minutes. And I think Anderson Cooper probably planned this ahead of time to smear Bernie, I bet you. And it was a very useful tactic and a very effective tactic. But considering that 60 Minutes' viewership is very old, and then bringing up Fidel Castro, it's like, okay, that's a disaster, right? That's bound to happen. But what was he supposed to do? Lie? Was he supposed to walk back his comments? I don't know. But it definitely would have been better if he were to, I guess, maybe just walk back the comments. I don't know. There really was no good situation there. But I do wish, because what that ended up doing was, it ruined the positive press for Bernie Sanders. Instead of having all this nonstop positive press after his destruction he did in Nevada, they're talking about Fidel Castro nonstop. So it ruins the whole media run afterwards. That's the big problem. So I'm not really sure what he could have done there, honestly. He's kind of screwed no matter what. I looked at the ad figures. The Sanders campaign spent nearly $7 million on ads in Iowa starting in October, and just over $1 million on ads in South Carolina starting in February. So, very lopsided ad numbers, of course. The fundamental challenge for the progressive movement is to build a much deeper alliance and relationship with the African American community. There's no path to the nomination without African American voters, nor should there be. That's from Ro Khanna. Some state lawmakers in South Carolina were annoyed that they didn't have a more prominent role in promoting the campaign in state. Again, a play on the motto. The motto was not me, us, but sometimes the feeling of us became questionable. Nina Turner, incidentally one of the aides encouraging Sanders to contrast with Biden earlier and more consistently, responds to SC critics. There were no roadblocks in their way to work with the campaign team in South Carolina to do what was necessary in their districts. Another sign of campaign indecision and disarray, Sanders kept his distance from Turner's op-ed in the SC newspaper attacking Biden's civil rights record, but he saw it and approved it before it went to print. So what's really interesting with this is that the Bernie Sanders campaign did a complete dog shit job of basically connecting with state level legislators in every state in the United States. But especially in South Carolina, one of the things that they say is that they only included the state representatives in one mailer. Like one mailer, they had them on there, which is like, dude, the way for them to connect is the leadership that they know, and you're not even connecting yourself to them. You're doing a garbage job of this. You know what I'm saying? So that was another fatal flaw, fatal mistake for the Bernie Sanders campaign. They fundamentally failed to do any endorsements, to court any endorsements, to get endorsements, and to consolidate endorsements, and to connect with these people. And it's embarrassing. It's honestly, and when everybody is saying, all of these people, when South Carolina state legislators, especially ones that already endorsed you in 2016 are now endorsing you now, and then other union leadership, they're all saying the same thing, it tells you something. And so when they're all saying Bernie is not doing enough for us so that we can have this mutual relationship, you know, if you want them to endorse you and then they need help to win their race, help them win their race, right? Have a connection, put them on mailers, all that kind of stuff. So when they're all saying the same thing, it means something, okay? So clearly a failure, a colossal failure to court endorsements, which is very disappointing. And Nina Turner started running the operation there, but she's from Ohio. She's not from South Carolina. So you got to get people in South Carolina. You got to get state reps in South Carolina. You can't get reps from, not even a rep, state senator from Ohio. She's not going to connect with them. She's not from South Carolina. So that was a poor decision and a poor job done by the campaign once again. It says, there was no plan for a moderate consolidation, and the professed strategy of expanding the electorate in a way that benefited Bernie disproportionately never panned out. There was a strategy to get to 30% and not 50%. So another interesting thing about this was that apparently senior staff only had meetings once a week, which is absolutely insane because so many things happen week to week. You should be speaking every day, probably multiple, at least twice a day would be ideal. But you definitely got to be speaking every day. And so again, it's the inaction of the campaign that's a failure. And I think it lies with Bernie choosing poor staff. I don't think Faiz Shakir was a good choice. He's a newbie. You don't choose a newbie in like a do or die situation. Keeping Longabaugh would have been huge. I think that if you kept him, I think we would have won. I actually think this campaign was DOA from the jump with Mark gone. I think that's what it is because Mark had the solutions to win. He had the strategies to win. He was also the only one who would actually say something that Bernie didn't like, despite him not liking it. Okay? What ended up happening was Bernie Sanders ended up surrounded by a bunch of yes men. Okay? Save for like David Sirota and sometimes Nina Turner. But for the most part, he's sort of surrounded by yes men. And that was a big mistake. And so I think the campaign was kind of DOA after letting go of your vets. You don't let go of your vets on your second run. You don't clean house. You gotta capitalize and you gotta win. And he had the solutions, but you let him go and then you hired a newbie, which is just not a good move. Harry Reid called Faiz Shakir, a former aide, to inform him a day before endorsing Biden. So that's not good. They failed to court Harry Reid's endorsement. An overarching theme in the story: when expert campaign advice made Sanders uncomfortable, his discomfort usually took precedence. When he let experts do their thing, as in greenlighting polling in May and unlocking funding for TV ads in October, his fortunes generally rose. So again, it seems like Bernie probably has just some not so good political instincts in terms of what to do, and that's why you have strategists, right? It's the whole point of having a team who are experts in this kind of a thing. And the only reason this campaign didn't completely implode is because of actions from like Jeff Weaver and stuff like that. Where they're like, dude, if you don't fund pollsters so we can figure out where the hell to advertise to, who to advertise to, and how to, I'm gonna leave the campaign. I'm gonna quit. Without stuff like that, I mean, this campaign would have been super DOA, like massively DOA. Um, it says, for a campaign that was deeply frustrated with this depiction in the media, it was sure odd they did not have a rapid response chief or even a team tasked with it. That's also not good. Um, and then also it says, I reported on AOC not hitting the trail as much as the campaign wanted. There were actually some Sanders allies who wanted her and other squad mates out front less, thinking they didn't help broaden the coalition. So it's tough, and the article also then talks about how AOC and the squad kind of saved the campaign, because if you guys remember, Bernie had the heart attack, looked like his campaign was pretty much over. He dipped in the polls, the narrative sort of started shifting, but AOC comes out, saves the campaign, and that's telling you, bro. Endorsements are crucial, man. Endorsements are game changers. Okay, and that's what you have to understand. Forget fundraising, bro. Think about endorsements. Like, forget money, bro. He spent so much money. Although, to be fair, Joe Biden got so much free coverage. So that's the problem, right? So I guess that's kind of defeating that whole argument. But still, endorsements are super, super crucial, okay? And there's no real way to fight MSM bias like that with small dollar donations. But endorsements are crucial. And so you got to start making inroads again. Longabaugh had the answer of, make inroads, figure out a way to make inroads, really get these people in state legislatures in South Carolina and all over the country, and people in the federal government and all that stuff. Figure out a way to pick them, But definitely not a good look for the Bernie Sanders campaign. I think his picks for the campaign were not good decisions. I think Faiz Shakir's campaign chair has failed. He was also traveling. Faiz Shakir was also traveling with Bernie Sanders at all times, even though his staff was saying, dude, you shouldn't be doing this. It's not typical for that to happen. It's not typical for a campaign chair to be traveling with the president who's campaigning. That's not how it's supposed to be, because the campaign chair is supposed to be able to talk directly to the aides constantly. But he was traveling with him, and so people are like, dude, this is like massive disconnect going on. And so they made a poor decision there. Also, as you guys know, when Faiz was talking to Bernie in one of his fireside chats, he was the one who told people to go out and vote when Bernie was saying it's a personal decision, and he wasn't telling people to go out and vote. So he's really messed up this campaign pretty bad. Another nugget from this piece is that basically there was no real like campaign news sort of headquarters or so, because people were like releasing their own stuff, and it would always be in conflict with the campaign. And so, for example, David Sirota had his Hear the Burn publication, but that didn't represent the campaign. So it's like, it doesn't represent the campaign, but it's called Hear the Burn. And so then you have all this stuff that's chaos. And so really what's going on here, the problems that plague this campaign, fundamentally speaking, really are, it's chaos. Bernie Sanders doesn't have good political instincts, and when you're supposed to have solid strategists, and some of these strategists had some good ideas, but a lot of those good ideas came from the more veteran folks like Jeff Weaver's, basically ultimatum of like, hey, fund the polling or I'm going to quit. He was from 2016 campaign, obviously. You let go of all your vets. Basically, you've hired newbies, and you're running a do or die campaign. It's like, well, it's not really a recipe for success. Now, would Bernie be winning right now if the moderates didn't consolidate? Probably, yeah. Maybe, probably, yeah. There's a chance for sure. There's a chance. So, endorsements. Bernie Sanders failed to court endorsements. He didn't even seem to care about endorsements of unions, of state legislators. Like, dude, when you're running for president, you need to like wine and dine these people, dude. You need to wine and dine these people, bro. And he didn't do any of that. He seemed to not care at all. So big mistakes from the Bernie campaign. Honestly, it's a bit sad, to be honest, at how bad this was. And man, letting go of Mark because of strategic differences, big mistake. Bernie's circle is very tiny, so it's very hard to get info to him, and basically everyone around him is a yes man. And it's like, well, that's not really a recipe for success, is it now? So a lot of big mistakes from the Bernie Sanders campaign. Hopefully, we can learn from this. But that's a sort of summary of all of the stuff that's included in this report. And yeah, so there that is.